Welcome to Roleplaying History, the podcast where we explore the history of role-playing games. I'm Wayne Davis, and I'll be your guide for today's tour. Episode 122, Dragonlance Modules. So, I know I'd originally promised 2 episodes of modules, and we did those the past couple of weeks, but when I was doing my research, I managed to come up with a stack of stuff on Dragonlance, so I decided we needed to go ahead and cover it this week because, well, it's Dragonlance. The Dragonlance setting for D&D and AD&D has enthralled the D&D universe since it first hit the market, and that's been more than proven by the number of supplements, artwork, and novels that have been sold. Now, we did an entire episode on Dragonlance a few months back, and you can catch that episode in the archives and on YouTube. It's also been proven out by the fact that the DL line of modules, with DL standing for Dragonlance, of course, is one of the largest lines in the long history of D&D modules. That means we've got a lot of subject matter for this week's show, but before we get to it, I needed to note that while I covered 1 or 2 of these in our best of shows, I'm covering all of them here so that we're covering the entire line consistently. So with that, let's crank up the tour bus and get to this week's show. Dragons of Despair was the first module in the Dragonlance line. Written by Tracy Hickman and released in 1984, it checked in at 32 pages with cover art by Clyde Caldwell and the interior art by Jeff Easley. Dragons of Despair has the distinction of being the first Dragonlance product released, as it dropped in March of 1984, while the first novel in the line didn't make it until October of that year. And TSR didn't skimp on the promotion for this either. They started running teaser ads in Dragon Magazine in January and February of 1984, and while those ads were small, about a quarter of a page each, they went full on with the April issue. The teasers had the Dragonlance logo and the words "coming soon," and the full-page ad went a bit further, giving the release date. Well, it didn't just give the release date. It gave the first look at the cover art for the module, though it was in black and white. That artwork was the now epic painting of the Black Dragon Kisanth fighting Goldmoon, Tanis Half-Elven, and Caramon Majere, and those 3 would be in the first novels. Now, obviously, the painting was in living color on the cover, and when I call it now epic, I'm not kidding. That art is hanging on the wall of more than one old school gamer, and you can buy prints of it at conventions all over the world. Check it for yourself and tell me if I'm telling lies on this one. Dragons of Despair was where we first got Draconians and Agar, which are Gully Dwarves. We also got the locations of Zaxaroth, Solace, and Haven. We also got the heroes of the Lance: Tanis Half-Elven, Sturm Brightblade, Cameron Majar, Reslin Majar, Flint Fireforge, Tasselhoff Burfoot, and Goldmoon. They come as pre-generated characters for the players to use, while Riverwind is an NPC in the game. Several other monsters and NPCs that played a part in the novels and future modules made their first appearances here, as this module set the stage for everything Dragonlance that followed. And while Dragons of Despair was originally designed for AD&D First Edition, the module has continued to live on. It was updated for the 2nd edition of AD&D, though it was repackaged with 3 other Dragonlance modules: Dragons of Flame, Dragons of Hope, and Dragons of Dissolution. It was titled Dragonlance Classics Volume 1 and was released in 1990. The next printing came in 1999 when Wizards of the Coast revised it again when the entire Dragonlance line got a special release, Dragonlance Classics 15th Anniversary Edition. That was part of the Silver Anniversary line. Fans have updated the module over the years as the newest editions of D&D have come out, though an official update hasn't hit the shelves. Now, since it's out of print, you know the drill: DM's Guild or Drive-Thru RPG. Dragons of Despair begins with our intrepid band of adventurers meeting up in Solace after 5 years working individually to look for any and all signs of what are called true clerics. They come together and work their way through a series of wilderness adventures as they search for the Blue Crystal Staff, which they're tasked with taking to Zaxaroth, which is an ancient ruined city. Once there, they start searching for knowledge of the ancient gods of good, which would help them to find those true clerics they've been looking for. This is where they first encounter Draconians and find themselves a couple of baby dragons. Of course, that leads them to meet Cassandre, whom they follow down a well into the first level of a dungeon, which then segues the adventure into something more conventional to AD&D adventures. Cassandre is the overall big bad evil guy, and when they hit the second level of the dungeon, the group has to take him on and take him out. When it's all said and done, they recover the discs of Mishkal, which allows for true clerics to return to Krynn for the first time in more than 300 years. Steve Hampshire handled the review of Dragons of Despair for the October 1984 issue of Imagine magazine. He admitted to having, quote, enjoyed this module a lot, end quote, and called it, quote, well-detailed and original. It plays well, end quote. He called it a good value, and the only issue he seemed to have with it was, quote, the rather flowery prose without being laughed down by the players, end quote. Dragons of Despair was intended for AD&D characters level 4 to 6. With a module that was such a strong starter to the line, DL2 had some big shoes to fill, and it managed to do that very thing. Dragons of Flame, written by Douglas Niles with art from Jeff Easley, released later in 1984 and was designed to be the follow-up adventure to Dragons of Despair. Dragons of Flame checks in at 32 pages with an outer cover and Jeff Easley's cover art, which is Tasselhoff Burfoot checking out a red dragon, and Veriminard of the Dragon Armies of Ansalon is also a big selling print. Much as with Dragons of Despair, Dragons of Flame debuts new adversaries for the PCs in the Capic Draconians. We also see the return of Agar and Baz Draconians from the previous release, and Qualinost and the Sla Mori are added as new locations. Also, the same pre-generated characters from Dragon of Despair are available, but their stats are updated to reflect the higher level range of the new module, which, for the record, is 5 through 7. We also get 2 new characters for players to play, as Tika shows up at the end of Chapter 6 and Gilthlanus at the end of Chapter 8. We also see the debut of Laurana, who will also show up as a playable character down the line in the 6th module. Getting into the module itself, we need to note that the first 4 chapters are what was in Dragons of Despair. Dragons of Flame brings 6 more chapters to the stories, so you need to have played the first module for some of the stuff here to make sense. The setup is that our band of merry men and women have returned to their hometown and found it's been overrun by evil entities. The elves of Qualinost make the decision to hire the group to free captives of the Draconians that are being held in Pax Tharkus, which is a pretty serious fortress. Now we're going to do this chapter by chapter because, well, why not? Chapter 5, titled Qui Kiri in the Plains, is, as the title would indicate, a series of encounters on the plains and in the ruins of Qui Kiri. These encounters also help to lay out the effects of the dragon armies on the area and sets the group on its way back to Solace. There's also an if needed encounter for the DM to use if the group decided to head off in another direction at the end of Dragons of Despair. It ends with the group being captured and returned to Solace so that this adventure could run as written. It's railroading, I know, but sometimes you've got to do what you got to do. Chapter 6, Solace, shows the destruction and devastation of Solace and ends with the group being arrested in the Inn of the Last Home. Tika and Gilthanus are also arrested, so that's how they get brought in for potential future use. Chapter 7, The Slave Caravan, takes place as the characters are being transported to Pax Tharsis as slaves. They get the opportunity to get to know Gilthlanus better, which again is intended to smooth the road for bringing him in as a PC later on, if needed. The chapter ends as the group is rescued by a batch of elves. Chapter 8, Elven Home, takes place pretty much exclusively at the home of the elves, who take the opportunity to provide the group with an update on the war. That makes it easier for them to request the group go out and rescue the slaves and hostages kept at Pax Tharsis. They also suggest Gilthlanus be included in the party. This is where Laurana is introduced, but she's quickly written out when she's kidnapped by Viewmaster Toad. Chapter 9, To the Walls of Pax Tharsis, makes Gilthlanus an official PC and brings the group to Sla Mori, which are the secret passages that would get the group into Pax Tharkus without needing to basically risk suicide going in the front doors. Chapter 10, The Tharkadan Towers, brings the conclusion of the module. The group has to both locate and rescue the various men, women, and children held captive, and it's a challenge since they're held all over the place. They encounter a ton of draconian and hobgoblin guards and have to avoid 2 ancient red dragons and the High Dragon High Lord, Verminard. But the story's not complete, as there are 2 more modules in the storyline, and we'll cover them as our next 2 entries. Rick Swan reviewed Dragons of Flame for the March-April 1985 issue of The Space Gamer. He loved the non-stereotypical characters, the engaging and challenging encounters, and what he deemed a well-crafted storyline. However, he noted, quote, "The story is so tightly scripted that occasionally players may feel more like observers than participants," end quote. He also urged DMs to be aware of this and take actions to keep the players active and on track. He concluded his review by stating, quote, "If you've given up on Dungeons & Dragons, Dragons of Flame is a great way to get reacquainted," end quote. We mentioned the various times Dragons of Flame reappeared in print, but otherwise it's been out of print for over 30 years. You know where to go if you're looking for it. DL3, Dragons of Hope, continues the excellent story that began 2 modules prior. Written by Tracy Hickman with cover art from Keith Parkinson and interiors from Parkinson and Larry Elmore, it was released in 1984 and checked in at 32 pages with an outer folder and a 2-color map. Dragons of Hope has the group freeing over 800 prisoners and refugees from Pax Tharkus, and they're all being pursued through the wilderness, with the army of Verminard close on their heels. They have to head through the Carolus Mountains, across the Durgoth Plains, make their way to Skullcap, and end their trek in Thorbidin. Needless to say, the adventure should have a happy ending, but it's D&D, so anything is possible. Now, Tracy Hickman added something a little more interesting to Dragons of Hope than we'd seen in the previous modules. Special rules and challenges were added in each region of the adventure, and those needed to be accomplished in order to reach the goal, which, as we noted, was getting the refugees to safety. There was also bonus XP available based on the number of refugees successfully led to safety. Our review for Dragons of Hope comes from Graham Staplehurst, who reviewed it for the July 1985 issue of White Dwarf. He gave it an overall score of 8 out of 10. He thought it was an improvement over Dragons of Flame and appreciated the greater control the players had over the story. He dinged the module for, quote, "much of the action turning on uncontrollable plot devices, with many poorly explained or of dubious value as contributions to the game," end quote. He also disliked, quote, "the rather ambiguous detailed area maps and events that were somewhat coerced and did not flow naturally from play," end quote. However, he closed by saying he, quote, "liked the free-ranging nature of the scenario rather than the usual confinement of dungeon pathways," end quote. The story arc ended with DL4, Dragons of Desolation. Written by Tracy Hickman and Michael Dobson, it was also released in 1984. Harold Johnson and Bruce Nesmith assisted in the creation of the adventure, and cover art was done by Keith Parkinson with interior art from Larry Elmore and Jeff Butler. It checked in at 32 pages with an outer folder and a large map. Parkinson's cover art shows our heroes riding away from the floating tomb of Durkin, and for Doctor Who fans, there's a couple of Easter eggs, as a tiny TARDIS, Doctor, and K9 are hidden throughout it. As we pick up this final adventure, the dragon armies have conquered the north, so our players have some work to do. Dragons of Hope has 5 chapters and an epilogue, and we'll run through it in chapter order. Chapter 14, The Doors of Thorbidin, starts our group off on a wilderness trip. It also includes Elistan appearing to be dead. The PCs have some strange dreams, and there's the possibility that they have a conversation with Verminard. The chapter comes to a close with the group coming to the doors of Thorbidin. Chapter 15, The North Gate of the Dwarves, brings the group into a dungeon, though there's not a lot in it. That dungeon leads them to the Dwarven realm underground. They meet the dwarf Armin Karis, and he's looking for his kidnapped half-brother Pick, and he warns them to avoid the Darrow City. Chapter 16, The Honor of the Hylar, brings the group to the Life Tree of the Hylar, and they get there either on their own or by being brought there. The Life Tree of the Hylar is a half-mile-high stalagmite, and it has a dwarven city carved into it. The group gets an audience with the Council of the Thanes, and they come to an agreement with the group. Recover the Hammer of Karis, and they'll allow the group and the refugees to pass through. They keep Eben Shatterstone as a hostage, or as collateral if you'd prefer, but Armenkaris travels with them in pursuit of the hammer. Chapter 17, Khalil Srith brings our group to the valley named Khalil Srith, which translates to the Valley of Thanes. This valley is enclosed by high mountains and is the place the dwarves bury their dead. The group finds Derkin's tomb floating above a lake, and they run into the gold dragon Evenstar, who guards the Hammer of Karis, which is inside the tomb. They wind up having to take on Ember, and that results in the death of both Ember and Evenstar. The group gets away on magical horses as the tomb sinks, and by the way, that is the image that's painted for the cover. Chapter 18, Dark Realms, finds the group hauling tail to escape the dragon armies, and one way or the other, we get to the climax of what's been called the first book of Dragonlance. They reach the Temple of Stars, where they take on Verminard and find out who the traitor is. Now, the epilogue wraps everything up, as the group should have recovered the Hammer of Karis and killed Verminard. If they didn't do it in time, the epilogue is probably the group's eulogy. We close the series with the wedding of Gold, Moon, and Riverwind, and the group pondering their next moves and/or adventures. We'll go back to Graham Staplehurst for our review, and he covered it in the July 1985 issue of White Dwarf. It got a 9 out of 10 overall, and he called it, quote, perhaps one of the most innovative scenarios that TSR have recently produced, end quote. He did warn DMs that they'd have a lot of work on their hands, but also noted that the reward would be well worth the effort. He said that because of, quote, some very interesting encounters and a mapping system I'm sure I'll want to use elsewhere, end quote. Now, after a 4-module storyline to begin the line, TSR pumped the brakes for DL5. Dragons of Mystery is not an adventure. What it is a source book, and Michael Dobson gets the credit for that 1984 release. Larry Elmore handled the artwork, and Dragons of Mystery checks in at 32 pages with an outer folder. Overall, Dragons of Mystery was designed to lay out the geography, creation myths, and gods of Krynn, as TSR realized the need to present information for DMs to design their own Dragonlance adventures. The book is divided into multiple sections, as you'd expect, and it also came with 2 maps. A Dungeon Master's Guild to the Dragonlance game Adventures provides a history of Dragonlance, as well as suggestions for how to run DL1 through DL4. It also includes errata for those 4 modules. It provides extra info on the Dragons of Kyrn, the Dwarves of Thorbidin, and the Council of Freedom, and the NPCs Verminard, Fizban, Sestoon, Fewmaster Toad, and Fistantlius. It's easy for me to say. The Companions of the Lance is a single page that brings info on our pre-generated characters and details them briefly as they appear in DL1. The Creation of the World and the Gods of Krynn provide background information on the Dragonlance series, both to assist the DM with running the modules and to build their own adventures. How the Heroes Met provides the backstory to explain how the heroes know each other and why they're so keen on working together. Our review comes from Alan Menard from the July 1985 issue of Imagine magazine. He provided a balanced but overall positive review, praising the background information from How the Heroes Met and the details from the Companions of the Lance. He did note that the info from the later section would have been a lot more useful if it had been provided back in DL1. His overall question is why it took so long to get this entry out, and while he recommended it, he noted it was, quote, in no way essential, end quote. Dragonlance went back to an adventure for the next entry. DL6, Dragons of Ice, was released in 1985. Designed for levels 6 through 9, it was written by Douglas Niles with cover art from Larry Elmore and interiors from Diana Magnuson. It checked in at 32 pages with a color map and an outer folder. Elmore's cover art was of Laurana, who really gets involved in this adventure, on an ice boat that's being attacked by a white dragon by the name of Sleet. This is another cover that's gotten printings over the years, and I know several folks that have this hanging somewhere in their home. For the record, 32 pages seems to be the norm for the modules in this line. It's just an observation. Also for the record, this adventure kicked off what was called the second book of the Dragonlance Chronicles, Dragons of Winternight. We start our adventure with the group in the port city of Tarsus. The dragon armies attack, and the party finds themselves driven south to Icewall Castle, which happens to be the home to both a white dragon and one of the dragon orbs, which are exceptionally legendary items. Sturm Brightblade, Flint Fireforge, Tasselhoof Burfoot, and Gilthanas from the first series of adventures are once again available as pre-generated characters to play, and Lorana and Elistan, who were NPCs in that same series, are now PCs and available. 2 new characters, Aaron Talbot and Derek Crownguard, Knights of Solamnia, are available, though at the DM's discretion. The thought here is that the rest of the PCs went a different direction, and we'll see them again in DL10. We'll check in with Alan Menard again for our review, and he did it for the September 1985 issue of Imagine magazine. His review was positive, and he notes it, quote, has something for everyone, end quote. He enjoyed the Tarsus portion of the adventure best as it, quote, leaves much discretion to the game master on how to make use of it, end quote. He did criticize the module for having a weak ending, noting that rather than have an ending, they just go directly into the next module. And while he said Dragons of Ice was worth playing, he suggested players wait until DL7 was released so that they could play the entire adventure in one run. So let's talk about DL7. Dragons of Light was written by Jeff Grubb, with a cover from Larry Elmore and interior art from Diana Magnuson, which makes sense since they'd done art for the previous module. It checked in at 32 pages with another large color map and an outer folder. As noted in the review for Dragons of Ice, Dragons of Light picks up immediately where we left off in that previous module. The group is in possession of the dragon orb they picked up, and they're on their way to the Whitestone Chapel by boat. Unfortunately, they find themselves shipwrecked, and they wind up on the shores of southern Urgoth. They wind up getting back together with the Qualinesti elves, and they run into the Sylvanesti refugees and the Cognoesti. The latter group finds themselves being taken advantage of by the other 2 groups. So after much interaction with all 3 groups, our intrepid band of adventurers head for Foghaven Vale, where they're in search of the Tomb of Huma. Huma, by the way, is an ancient hero who wielded the Dragonlance. What they find ultimately is the secrets of the lance's creation, and they wind up encountering a silver dragon that will probably wind up flying off to avoid too much combat. No review for Dragons of Light, mostly because I had to dig up so far to find any usable information that reviews were the last thing on my list, so sorry. DL8, Dragons of War, was written by Tracy and Laura Hickman, with cover art from Keith Parkinson and interiors by Diana Magnuson. This 32-page book with outer folder and map was released in 1985. This entry isn't going to get a lot of coverage, and that's because there was even less usable information online than there was for DL7. I've got a synopsis. It goes like this. The characters head off to the Tower of the High Clerist, and they wind up joining forces with the Knights of Solamnia in their battle with the Draconians. That's pretty much the adventure, but we do get back to a riff on an idea from earlier in the module line. There are simple battle rules included with the module, and they come in an included 8-page pamphlet. That being said, the battle system rules can also be used for this adventure. And while I don't have a review, there is a note on RPG.net that gives the adventure a 9 out of 10 and states, quote, the High Clerist's Tower might be the single most detailed castle map ever published for D&D, end quote. DL9, Dragons of Deceit, written by Douglas Niles, with cover from Larry Elmore and interiors from Diana Magnuson, checked in at 48 pages with an outer folder and a cardstock counter sheet when it was released in 1985. We pick up where we left off in Dragons of War, with the group licking their wounds from that battle before being tasked with heading to the City of Sanction, which is located in the very heart of Toxis's empire. Try saying that 3 times real fast. They're asked to find the key to the Good Dragon's Oath of Neutrality, and the hope is that if they get that, it'll help bring those dragons into the war against the Draconians. Needless to say, over the course of the adventure, the group will find themselves battling chromatic dragons, while the good dragons will eventually get into the fight. The info for Dragons of Deceit includes rules encounters, which explains the cardstock for handling aerial battles. Again, no review, but the number of positive notes from RPG.net are almost off the chart. The next entry in the series is DL10, Dragons of Dreams. While you'd think it wraps the series up, you'd be wrong, and we'll get to that later on. Written by Tracy Hickman with a cover from Clyde Caldwell and interiors from Diana Magnuson, it was released in 1985. It checked in at 32 pages with an 8-page pamphlet of maps and charts and an outer folder. We mentioned earlier that some of our group from the first series went a different direction than the group we followed to this point. This is where we bring in Tanis, Karaman, Rastlin, and the rest of that group. The group is tasked by Princess Alhana to enter the Land of Dreams, as the Sylvanesti elves are gone. The group needs to figure out why magical nightmares are taking place, and if they succeed, they will bring the elves back. Reviews on RPG.net for this are harsh. Best I saw was 5 out of 10 with the note, quote, absolute bloodbath. Hard to play straight through without a skilled and agreeable player group, end quote. Ouch. And by the way, I trust RPG.net on this because that tends to be players. DL11, Dragons of Glory, takes a break from the series that had been going to this point and is a completely standalone release. Written by Douglas Niles and Tracy Hickman, cover art was handled by Jeff Easley, and interiors were from Diana Magnuson and Jeff Butler. It was a 16-page pamphlet, an 8-page pamphlet, 2 large color maps, a cardboard counter sheet, a small zip-locked bag, and an outer folder. Dragons of Glory is, in a nutshell, a war game. It's the Dragon High Lords versus the Whitestone forces of Krynn, and there's an opportunity to recruit neutral countries for help, and that's for both sides. I'm not a big fan of this module personally, because I'd rather have an adventure than a war game, so I apologize for shorting the info on this one. I'm also holding the reviews for this because both of the reviews I have pretty much trash it, so let's move along. DL12, Dragons of Faith, gets us back into the storyline we'd been running before the break with DL11. Written by Harold Johnson and Bruce Hurd, it had cover art from Jeff Easley and interiors from Diana Magnuson. Released in 1986, it clocked in at 64 pages with a large map, cardstock sheet, cardstock counter sheet, and an outer folder. There was also a pack of Talus cards, as Talus is a fictional Krynn card game, so the cards were presented to bring a sense of authenticity to overall things. And Dragons of Faith contained a set of battle system miniatures rules for those interested in using them for combat. We pick up basically where we left off at the end of Dragons of Deceit, with our group leaving Sylvanesti during the prologue and making their way to the city of Flotsam. Unfortunately for the group, Flotsam is an evil city, so they need to haul tail out of there and make their way across the Blood Sea. In the process of doing that, they make their way to Istar, the City of the Deep. And as we've come to expect by this point in the line, the sea elves of the area are being threatened by the dragon armies, so the group is, of course, engaged to help them. This is where the battle system rules come into play. Once that's done, the group makes their way the rest of the way across the Blood Sea, avoiding the minions of the Dragon High Lords along the way. John S. Davies handled the review in the August-September 1986 issue of Adventurer, which was a British magazine. He knocked the module maps for not being properly numbered, in spite of the locations being numbered in the text. He also noted that Dragons of Faith, quote, departs from the style of previous Dragonlance modules in that it gives a lot of general background information for those areas that are not in the main storyline and allows the characters a lot more freedom in how they reach their eventual goal, end quote. He concluded, quote, although it is expensive, it is a pleasing continuation of the Dragonlance saga, though it does not work as a standalone module, end quote. We move on to DL13, Dragons of Truth. Written by Tracy Hickman, Jeff Easley and Diana Magnuson once again handled the cover art and the interior art, respectively. Released in 1986, it checked in at 40 pages with a large 2-color map and an outer folder. Picking up basically where we left off in Dragons of Faith, the party is making their way through Draconian-controlled lands, searching for the heart of the Dragon Empire. However, they find themselves in the Glitter Palace of Paladine, where the gods themselves test the group time and time again before they ultimately rise to the challenge and achieve success. Again, reviews are hard to find, but looking at player reviews on RPG.net, I noted a lot of 5 out of 10 reviews, and one comment I saw noted that we got, quote, Divine Intervention Railroad long after it would have been the most useful, end quote. DL14, Dragons of Triumph, wraps up the series. Written by Douglas Niles with cover art from Clyde Caldwell and interiors from Diagna Magnuson, Larry Elmore, and Jeff Easley, it had a 40-page book, a 32-page book, a 24-page source book, a large color map of the world, and an outer folder. In Dragons of Triumph, we bring our divided party back together, and part of the provided books update all of the character information for those who didn't or couldn't keep score at home. We also get a combined list of all the monster stats from the rest of the modules in the line. As was noted in more than one review, this was a combination sourcebook and scenario, but we're here for the scenario, so let's summarize that. I mentioned we were wrapping up the series, so this is where the rubber meets the road. The group has to cross a land of smoke and fire to reach the capital of the Dragon Empire. Their reward? An encounter with the Dragon Queen Tahisis at her temple in Naraka. The group must drive her back to her own plane in order for the forces of good to win the day. This is yet another module where the battle system rules can be used, and they're provided yet again for the DM's use. John S. Davies gets the review again, and this one was for the February 1987 issue of Adventurer. He had good things to say about the maps, noting, quote, "It is handy having the maps in a separate book and not having to flick backwards and forwards, or having to consult a large map like that presented for the Tower of the High Clerist," end quote. He also noted that, quote, "Dragons of Triumph can be played alone, but is better played as the final part of the Dragonlance saga," end quote. His close was, quote, "When DL1 was released, it showed a lot of promise as a truly epic series, which unfortunately some of the later adventure packs have not lived up to. DL14, however, was well worth waiting for. It brings the hero's quest to a culmination in a final battle against Time and the Dark Queen, which could give any party a real challenge," end quote. So if we're at the end of the Dragonlance saga, what could the final two modules in the series possibly be about? Tell you what, let's cover them and find out for ourselves. DL15, Mists of Krynn, was released in 1988, and Mike Brault gets the editor credit, as a dozen different writers were involved with writing the various scenarios contained within. Denise Bouveau did the cover, and Valerie Valisek covered the interiors. This bad boy came in at 128 pages, and the reason for that is that there are 12 different scenarios presented in the module. Normally, I'd have a blow-by-blow breakdown of each of the scenarios, but I wasn't able to get much of a breakdown of those online without having to buy a copy. What I can tell you is that Mists of Krynn brings new NPCs, new monsters, and plenty of action and adventure to the table for your players, and it gives an opportunity to start at level 1 and run all the way to 15 without having to wait for a new release. No review for this, but our friends at RPG.net seem to like it well enough, offering an average of 7 out of 10. Last up is DL16, World of Krynn. Released in 1988, Douglas Niles, Michael Gray, and Harold Johnson get the writer's credit, while the cover was handled by Clyde Caldwell and interiors from a literal cast of dozens. It checked in at 96 pages with an outer cover. World of Krynn provides 4 new scenarios to the Dragonlance universe, and they're all set after the War of the Lance. There are 3 dungeon crawls and a wilderness quest included, and they take place in the Minotaur land of Mythos, in Dargard Keep, and in Palanthas. It's built for characters level 5 through 12. We've got a review from Lawrence Schick, who wrote in his 1991 book, Heroic Worlds, that World of Krynn was standard stuff. That being said, he claims that, quote, "fans of Dragonlance will find intriguing details about the history of Krynn," end quote. As I noted more than once during the early part of this show, none of these modules are still in print, so I'd recommend the DM's Guild or Drive-Thru-RPG if you're looking for copies. There are also a number of fan sites online that have modified these modules for the various editions of the game that followed. And as much as I love Dragonlance, I've just about had my fill for the day, so let's bring our tour to a close. Next week, we're going to deep dive a new game system book that's just recently been released, and it's EZD6. I've got a copy of this that I'm working through, and we'll cover all the details next week. Now, before I wrap things up, I wanted to take a moment to thank everyone who dropped by our table at Archon 46 over the weekend last week. We had a lot of great conversation, and I hope you enjoyed the live edition of Role-Playing History we put out for you. And to address a question I got a couple of times, we're considering that an alpha test for a potential 2.0 version of Role-Playing History that we might try in the future. Again, thanks to everyone who joined us, and I'll let you know when and if we hit up another convention in the future. As always, we encourage you to scratch your gaming podcast itch by checking out our other fine podcast, Bad GM's Campaign Build Along. This week, our group gets a taste of who's pulling the strings behind the kidnapping of their benefactor, and we start to ramp up to what's going to be the ultimate conflict of our campaign. Bad GM's Campaign Build Along is available wherever you get your podcasts or on our website, badgmproductions.net. The music for this show comes from Pixabay.com. Check them out for all your license-free, royalty-free music needs. Role-Playing History is a production of Bad GM Productions. We're all over social media, so check the info box for this show or our website, badgmproductions.net. Next week, we check out EZD6. I can tell you that from what I've read to this point, I think you're going to like it. That's next week. Until then, I'm Wayne Davis, and your Role-Playing History.